Hello, everybody. This is Margot. I am a volunteer with the Washington State Beekeepers Association, and we are here with Ask a Washington Beekeeper. Our presenter is Ellen Miller, who has been a beekeeper for many years, and she's going to be giving a presentation tonight about honeybee communication. The idea behind Ask a Washington Beekeeper was that anyone throughout the state who had questions about beekeeping could get on and listen to a presentation and then ask any questions that they want to about beekeeping. So if you would put your questions into the chat as we go along, we will read them and answer them. And uh, and really that's about it. So Ellen, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Thank you, Margot, very much. And welcome all of you who are hopefully listening to this program. As Margot said, I'm Ellen Miller. My husband and I have been involved with honeybees since the latter 1970s. I've always been a hobbyist beekeeper. My husband and I usually keep between 2 and 5 colonies, since that's all that our local environment can support. We live in Eastern Washington in a rural area and rely mostly on wildflowers for forage for our bees. With the past 4 years of dearth, especially, we're not able to support more colonies. But this is enough for us since we aren't interested in harvesting honey, just enough for our bees to overwinter and from time to time to give honey jars to friends and neighbors as gifts. Is really all that we are looking for. What has kept us interested in bees for so long is the fact that we keep learning from them. And what we learn is so interesting that we just don't seem to be able to stop. So that's why we do bees and why we continue to do bees. And what I was really interested in several years ago was, since the bee is a super organism, and because they do so much communication with such a tiny brain, how in a dark hive, how is it that they do communicate? And bit by bit, I was learning about things and understanding things, but always in bits and pieces. So a couple of years ago, I decided I really wanted to get into this topic and really understand the whole picture of honeybee communication. This presentation is not going to be the whole story about honeybee communication because, quite truthfully, I don't know if anybody's gotten the whole story yet. But I do like to share information that I've learned. So I came up with this program, and we thought that sharing it here on Ask a Washington Beekeeper would be a great way to spread some of this information. And hopefully you find this topic as interesting as I do. We all know that bees are a superorganism, which is defined by the following characteristics. They have cooperative brood care. They have overlapping generations within a colony of adults and a division of labor into reproductive and non-reproductive groups. The division of labor creates specialized behavioral groups, which are referred to frequently as castes. We call them workers, queens, drones. The eusocial behavior is found in a variety of animals, mostly insects. Ants and bees exhibit this, some wasps, some termites, even a cockroach or two, some thrips, aphids. And those are most of the ones that I can think of. There's actually a couple of vertebrae that engage in true eusocial behavior. They happen to be the naked mole rat and the Darnallan mole rat, which I'd never heard about before until I was looking into what critters do exhibit eusocial behavior. So now you know that some mole rats do exhibit it as well. you know that the inside of the hive is busy. The picture that we're showing here is a typical brood box about this time of the year. It's full of bees. They're all active, taking care of brood, making sure they're fed, keeping busy. And there's thousands of moving bees and doing specific time-sensitive duties that are necessary to keep the colony surviving. Inside that box are these vertical walls. And as you know, they're pretty tight. They have at least 3/8 of an inch bee space, but that's about it. So that's where the environment that the communication takes place. They maintain their brood, they're cleaning emerged cells, they're feeding larvae, they're traveling from box to box, they're transporting nectar, pollen, and water. In the midst of all this, which seems to us like bedlam, communication occurs. And how is this possible? We know that a forager who finds a great source of nectar returns to her colony and she tells other foragers about the great find that she's made. How does she convey this information so that other foragers can access the same great source? What tools do they have at their disposal to help them know about food, water, pollen, or to help them know when their queen isn't performing, or to help them know when it's time to cap a nectar cell, or to help them know when it's time to swarm? With all their needs to communicate within that structure, how do they communicate so successfully? Especially when you stop to think that the size of their brain is the size of a sesame seed. Small though it might be, the brain of a honeybee consists of plus or minus 1 million neurons. Honeybees contradict the notion that insect behavior tends to be relatively inflexible and sort of stereotypical. Indeed, they live in colonies and exhibit complex social, navigational, and communication behaviors. How do they collect the information their brains need to make decisions? Their most important communication tool is their antenna. Before I started doing research on this, I knew bees had antennae, of course, and I knew that they were important for, some taste sensory type of things, but I never dreamt that they were as important as they are in communication. They're involved in taste, in scent, in temperature, in detecting carbon dioxide, humidity, wind speed, gravity, and sound. They serve as a multifunctional sensory organ and are the primary tool for navigating their environment. The sensilla are the hair-like structure on the antenna, and it can taste, smell, sense temperature, carbon dioxide, and all the other items listed on the slide. Attennation is the process in which bees use their antenna to communicate with each other. As we know, social bees have receptors that can perceive queen pheromones, behavioral pheromones, and chemicals, which can affect the social structure of the entire colony, making the antenna a critical part of their anatomy. Let's take a much closer look at what that antenna really is consisting of. And right now, this picture here of an antenna is basically all that I thought about. I knew it connected to the head. I knew that it had an elbow joint and that it could move. What else can it do? So here are the parts of the antenna. The sensilla are the hairs that cover the antenna itself. It's divided into 3 main parts. The first part, which comes from the socket, is called the scape. And attached to the distal end of the scape is the pedicel. This little joint right here, the elbow, if you will. It's a very short piece, but it is pivotal to the use of the antenna. The end, the longest portion of the antenna, is the flagellum. These two pieces, the scape and the pedicel, are what cause the flagellum to move. If you look at a bee whose antenna is flexed or bent, you can see the proportion in size and length. Most of the sensory in the antenna happens in the flagellum. It's divided, as you can see, these segments here. They're divided into subsegments called phlagomeres. In nearly all species, including the honeybee, females have 10 phlagomeres and males have 11, making this an important tool for people who are working with insects to determine the sex easily and quickly. The outer surface is covered with different types of receptors, and that's where you start getting into some of the microscopic pictures that are up here on the slide. You can see the blunt spikes, the longer spikes, the dips, and the pits. The different types of receptors have special purposes. They can be identified basically by their shape and are often described as plates, pits, pegs, and hairs. In general, peg organs are chemoreceptors used for smelling. Sensory hairs are mechanoreceptors used for tactile functions. And plate organs are both chemo and photoreceptors. Estimates vary, but each worker antenna has roughly 3,000 chemoreceptors, whereas a queen's antenna has only about 1,600. But drones, whose job it is to find virgin queens in midair, have an estimated 300,000 chemoreceptors, obviously making them much more receptive to the smell and location of a queen. The distribution of sensors on the antenna is very specific. For example, on the honeybee, there's a tuft of sensory hairs at the very tip of the flagellum, and it determines the surface texture, which is important when the bee is out foraging. Temperature sensors are found on the last 6 segments in here. And the majority of olfactory sensors, called pore plates, as you can see in this picture here, these are pore plates, are distributed over the last 8 segments. The gustatory sensors, far fewer in number, are thread-like chemoreceptors. And they are used definitely to help determine pheromones, humidity, carbon dioxide, gravity, and shape. An example of one of the many functions of bee antenna is their use to perceive substances, such as ethyl oleate, a primer pheromone that the bees excrete that regulates the development of foragers. An increasing level of ethyl oleate is the signal from the active foragers that the workforce is large enough. As a result, the rate of transition of nurse bees into foragers slows down, and bees prolong their nursing phase. When the workforce drops, ethyl oleate levels decrease, and the rate of maturation from in-hive bees to foraging bees returns to normal. But if lots of foragers are lost through chemical or accidental issues, then bees will accelerate development and transition to foraging. An additional receptor known as the Johnson's organ is found inside the pedicel at the base of the flagellum. Remember right here. This sensor is able to detect vibrations and slight changes in the position of the antenna. For example, in flight, bending of the antenna due to airflow helps the bee to determine her speed through the air, or the wind speed. Bee antennae are in constant motion, touching, reaching, bending, and seeking. With so many receptors of different types, a seemingly endless stream of environmental data flows into the bee's brain, leading us to understand better how honeybees communicate. Let's take a look at specific kinds of communication. We'll look at the following types, such as movement, sight, smell, taste, touch, and vocalization. The first one, movement, is a means of communication that we probably know the most about, specifically the dance, which uses several body parts besides the antenna. Since the Johnson's organ detects sound vibrations, is sometimes called the bee's ear. But unlike the typical ear, the Johnson's organ is able to detect extremely slight deflections, such as those caused by both magnetic and electric fields created when bees move. And these fields cause small but perceptible antennal movements in a receiving bee. The Johnson organ is responsible for the bee's ability to read dance language, even in the dark. The dancing bee causes sound waves to travel through the air. These waves deflect and vibrate the flagellum of a listening bee. The vibrations are transmitted from the flagellum to the pedicel, where they bounce into a tight membrane that separates the pedicel from the scape. You can think of this intersegmental membrane as being similar to an eardrum. When it vibrates, it stimulates sensory cells in the pedicel, which then sends nerve impulses to the bee's brain. While the dance itself is a visual cue, the antennae play a crucial role in reinforcing the message. Observing bees use their antenna to touch the dancing bee, picking up additional clues through the vibrations and the pheromones. This multi-sensory communication ensures that the message is accurately conveyed and understood. If you'll take a look in the picture and carefully look at where the antennae are placed, this one is real clear. It's tight, straight out, and touching the dancing bee. There's another one that you can see right here doing the same thing. And I know that antennae are tiny and they're overlaid with wings, so it is a little bit difficult to see. But most of the antennae in this picture are straight out and they're focused on the vibrations coming off of that bee. Now, as you probably know, the different dances, the round dance, the sickle dance, the waggle, and one that I hadn't really known much about, the treble dance, are the four main dances that bees do. The round dance is when the bee has found a great source of forage near the hive, and they don't need to give coordinates at all. It's basically within 10, maybe up to 80 yards away from the colony, and the scent from the source of the food, as well as the movement, indicate that it's close enough to pick up a scent once the bee leaves the hive, and just circle around the hive and you will smell the source that I'm encouraging you to go to. So they don't need further direction. The sickle dance is a transition dance. between the round dance and the waggle dance. And it's sort of in the shape of a sickle. It is for 50, maybe up to 100 yards between, indicating that distance to find the forage source. And then when you get out past that 100 yards, it becomes what we think of more often, the waggle dance. And as you probably know, it involves a shivering side-to-side motion, sort of like the bee in that picture is demonstrating, of the abdomen while moving in a figure 8. The vigor of the waggle, the number of times it's repeated, the direction of the dance, and the sounds the bee makes communicate precise information about the location of the food source. The dancing bee pauses between performances to offer potential recruits a taste of the forage that has been brought back to the colony. So they get a taste as well as directions. Using a bee that has discovered, for example, a flowering cherry, it will return to that cherry carrying some nectar. She'll return to the hive carrying some of the nectar from the cherry. She transfers the nectar to a receiver bee, leaves the nest again to return to the same cherry tree. This can be repeated multiple times. Presumably, each time it takes less time for the trip, and we assume that that means that the flight path is more efficient, more direct each time that she goes out for it. Once the quickest way has been found, which can take up to 8 to 10 different flights, the bee will begin her dance. If you want more information about how the dance actually functions, one of the resources that I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, The Buzz About Bees by Jürgen Totz, is a very, very good resource. The duration of the waggle run is made conspicuous beside the darkness in the hive. The dancer audibly buzzes her wings while waggling her body, and that is directly proportional to the length of the outward journey. On average, 1 second of the combined body waggling and wing buzzing represents 1,000 meters or 6/10 of a mile of flight. The angle of the waggle run relative to straight up on the vertical comb represents the angle of the outward journey relative to the sun. Thus, if a successful forager walks directly upward while producing a waggle run, she indicates that the feeding place is in the same direction as the sun, or she heads 40 degrees to the right of the vertical. Her message is the feeding place is 40 degrees to the right of the sun. The bees that follow a dancer, monitoring her waggle runs, are able to decode her dance and put her flight instructions into action. What I thought was interesting is this dance and its meaning were discovered in 1944 by Karl von Frisch at the University of Munich. He received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1973, along with Nicholas Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz for this discovery, demonstrating that the worker honeybee informs her hive mates of the direction and distance to a rich food source by means of dance behavior. I thought that was really pretty nifty that our honeybees were awarded, or research on them was awarded a Nobel Prize. Another fact that I discovered is the area of the dance floor, remember it's vertical, is only about 2 to 5 centimeters in diameter. The dance takes place in a small area close to the entrance. Dancers meet foragers that are interested in their message on this dance floor, which is apparently chemically marked by the colony. The antenna of the dance followers are used like a sight-impaired person's cane to detect the movement of the dancer. The rhythmic back and forth oscillations of the dancer's body tap out the waggle and the rhythm on the stiffly outstretched antenna of the dance followers. It is theorized that information about the duration of the waggle phase, the distance to the food source, and the location of the dancer relative to gravity, the direction to the food source, is thus encoded. Now, the dance that I didn't know anything about until recently is the tremble dance. It was identified by Tom Seeley to describe the communication between foragers and storers as a means of allocating more or less bees to each task based on the resources available and the needs of the colony. In the case of the tremble dance, which can last for up to a half hour, the bees expressing this dance travel throughout the brood nest, not just dancing on the dance floor. The bees shake their body back and forth while rotating at about 50 degrees per second while walking slowly across the comb. The link that I have on the slide, we're not going to play tonight because there have been some technical issues attempting to access the links through our format here. But I have it on the slide so that you can go back to the recording and check this out. It's a very good view of the bee dance and how communication works within the dance. The sense of sight is not antenna based, is the eyes. And basically the eyes, we have some researchers that do a lot of bee eye research, and they call the bee the superhero, and its sight would be its superpower. They are very impressed with the intensity and the functionality that the bee eyesight has. If you'll notice in the drone, the eyes cover basically the whole head, with an ocelli in the little triangle here in the middle. The worker bee has a smaller eye, but all the eyes have these tiny, tiny hairs. And we'll talk about what all this means. The two different types of eyes have separate functions. The compound eyes and the ocelli work together to provide bees with a unique visual experience. The three smaller eyes in the center top of the bee's head are called ocelli. Ocelli comes from the Latin word ocellus, which means little eye. These little bee eyes have single lenses. They enable the bee to judge light intensity and stay oriented, unlike their compound eyes, which are primarily used for detecting shapes, movement, and color. The ocelli help bees maintain stability and balance during flight. The two large compound eyes are made up of thousands of tiny lenses called facets. Each of these facets takes in one small part of the insect's vision. The bee's brain then converts these signals to a mosaic-like picture made of each image. Worker bees have 6,900 facets in each eye, and drones have 8,600 facets. Once again, more important to see that queen. Every facet is connected to a tiny tube. A bee is able to see color because each of these tiny tubes contains 8 cells that respond to light. 4 of these cells respond to yellow-green light, 2 respond to blue light, and 1 responds to ultraviolet light. Each of these units, called a metatetum, contains a lens, a facet, if you will, a cone of visual cells, and a pigment that helps separate it from its neighbor cells. This intricate arrangement allows bees to have a wide field of view and detect movement with incredible precision. While bees see fewer pixels than humans, they process the information 5 times quicker. Humans generally see in the 700 to 400 nanometer range, while bees can see from 600 to 300 nanometers. The 400 to 300 nanometer section of the spectrum includes the ultraviolet light. Studies have shown that if deprived of ultraviolet light, bees lose interest in foraging and will remain in the hive until they're forced out by starvation. UV light, which can penetrate cloud cover, is critical in bees' ability to find nectar. Bees don't see the same flower color that we do. The UV pattern on the petals of a flower can be compared to the landing deck on an aircraft carrier. Those patterns guide the bee to land at the nectar source. It also explains how bees are able to select a particular species of flower from a field of white flowers. Bees aren't just seeing white flowers, they're seeing flowers with distinct UV markers. In fact, bees will head to the UV absorbing area of a flower first. It is their bullseye. And just because the flower is not attractive to us doesn't mean it's ugly to a bee. Recent studies have shown that weeds are more successful than other plants because they're more attractive to the pollinators. As one beekeeper said, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But a bee's super sight powers go much further than seeing mere colors. A bee can also detect polarized light. Polarized light moves in one direction. It's caused when air molecules from the atmosphere scatter the photons to create what's been described as a superhighway of light. A bee's amazing eye can scan and match the polarization patterns in the sky. It's a bee's version of GPS. They are able to use this polarized light as a navigating system. What makes this such a powerful tool is that bees can use polarized light to locate direction even when the sun is not shining. They then communicate these directions to the colony. Basically, it's a bee roadmap. Bees can find their way back home by checking the pattern of polarized light in the sky. The polarized light provides bees with a reliable and consistent reference point, even in challenging environmental conditions. Smell as another communication tool. The antennal sensors help maintain the colony as a cohesive unit. We've talked about this a lot already, but here's just being reinforced once again. We know how important pheromones are to the colony for not only inside and information about the how the colony is doing, but also in foraging and in determining potential threats. They allow the workers to monitor the queen by tracking her pheromones. They allow bees to read messages of danger, such as the alarm pheromone. When pheromones are detected by another insect of the same species, they cause a behavioral or physical response. And pheromones can travel through the air like odors, or from bee to bee by physical contact or trophallaxis. The bee's sense of smell is especially attuned to odors associated with food. This heightened sensitivity allows workers to find flowers and other potential food sources, including neighboring hives. Since a bee has two antennae, she can compare the relative strengths of the two signals to guide her to the source. She uses this comparative analysis to fly in the direction that's slightly stronger, continually adjusting her flight as she follows the odor stream. Another example is the sensors on the antenna can detect small changes in carbon dioxide, allowing the bees to take corrective action. As carbon dioxide in the hive rises, bees may increase fanning to aid ventilation and lower the carbon dioxide concentration. The ability to detect carbon dioxide may also assist with colony defense. Sometimes spikes in carbon dioxide levels are due to the exhalation or of a threatening creature, such as a beekeeper. Tactile, once again, is the antenna. If the distribution of sensors on the antenna is very specific. For example, the honeybee uses the tuft on the end of the flagellum. There's just a tiny point right here of all those little hairs to determine surface texture. And surface texture is really important when the honeybee is wanting to be direct and get to the nectary as quickly as possible. Using this hollyhock as an example, there's a texture trail that gives the bee a landing zone. She doesn't have to walk in from the outside. She can land and know immediately where to go for the nectar. Honeybees also use their tactile sense to build wax combs. Although the hive interior is dark, the bees can detect comb dimensions with their antenna. The shape of the cells, as well as the thickness and depth of the wax walls, are determined by using their antenna. If you can look at this picture, there are several bees in here. This one you can see is using her mouth parts to shape the cell wall. But if you look in here, this one is using her antenna to measure the size and shape of what has been built or what is being built. So the use of that antenna is phenomenal. Taste. Since bees are extremely attuned to the taste of sweetness, they can decide whether a certain nectar is worth collecting. Nectar with a very low sugar concentration could be a waste of time for the honeybee to harvest. So after a quick taste with their antenna, a forager can reject the source and search for something better. Although bees also have taste receptors on their mouth parts and feet, the antennal taste receptors often make the initial contact and determine if the bee will spend time collecting nectar. The antennae are very active during trophallaxis, which is the transfer of food from one bee to another. It's believed that bees, both givers and receivers, signal their readiness to begin food transfer by using their antenna. In addition, the antennae help them align their bodies for the transfer. Like nearly everything else a honeybee does, trophallaxis usually happens in total darkness, so bees must rely on tactile clues to get the job done. Let's take a look at these pictures. Here's a good case of one bee transferring, I'm assuming nectar, but it could be nectar or water, to another bee. The proboscis is inside the mouth part of the receiving bee, and you can see how their antennae are touching and are basically hooked together. Remember, I said that usually this transfer of information takes place inside the hive. This was a picture that I was able to get on the outside of a hive. Here's the bee who's providing the information, the nectar, to the bees that are lined up to get a taste. So she's very excited about what she's got. She wants to share it, and these bees want to receive the information, and this bee is providing the same thing. Here's another example of trophallaxis in the sharing, and you can see the bee mouth parts together. And here's inside the hive. See how the antennae are positioned in the mouth parts with the nectar going in from one bee to another. Food exchange can go two ways. When bees are trying to communicate the need for supplies, or it may go only one way, as when a forager with a full stomach transfers her load of nectar, passing it to a house bee for processing. One house bee can transfer and process incoming nectar, passing it from bee to bee until it's ready to cap. Vocalization is something that I never thought about in bees. mean, of course, they make sounds. You can hear them buzz. You can tell when they're happy and when they're not happy. But they actually do produce what's called a vocal sound. We don't, they do this by pressing their thorax against a substrate in the hive and vibrating their flight muscles. The queen, to give a little extra oomph to her vocalization, presses her thorax against the comb to give her voice more range. This vibration produces an auditory sound that even humans can hear. Attempting to describe these sounds, as you can see by the names that they're given, is confusing. The several queen voices that are expressed in a colony, piping, teeting, tooting, once again, descriptors by people who are trying to tell you what the sound is a prolonged long tone followed by shorter tones, each decreasing in length. And it's made by a newly emerged queen to let the colony know she's arrived. Workers helping the next queen to emerge become motionless, delaying her emergence. The quacking or quacking is made by a queen that still is in the cell in response to the piping of an emerged queen, letting her know that she has rivals. But depending on the strength of the colony, the decision may be made to allow more than one queen to emerge. If this is the case, the first virgin queen allowed to emerge will not attack another emerging queen. Instead, she will leave with a secondary or after swarm if the colony is able to support it. This does mean that she relinquishes the wealth of resources in the parent colony. In a few days, when she's ready to fly, she will be pushed out of the colony during the departure of a secondary swarm. This process is repeated until a colony is weakened to the point it cannot support another swarm. The queens waiting to emerge are fed by workers through holes made in the sides of the queen cells, just large enough for workers' tongues. But they're not allowed to emerge until the queen that has first emerged leaves with the swarm. At the point that there are still virgin queens in the colony, and the colony feels that the colony is strong enough for more after swarms, the workers will allow them to emerge. If the colony has not made a decision about allowing after swarms, the first queen out usually attempts to kill the others by chewing small holes in the cell and stinging the occupant. If two or more virgin queens emerge at the same time, they will fight to the death by seizing each other and attempting to sting. Ultimately, one queen succeeds and the other collapses, paralyzed, falling from the comb, and soon dies. This process continues until there's only one queen remaining alive. Once again, the link on the slide is an example of the sound of queen piping. And I would encourage you to listen if you've never heard the queen talk. We don't have time to play it tonight. And there, once again, are some technical issues that we don't want to run into. But you can come back on and listen to it. If you haven't ever heard a vocalization of the queen, it is an interesting sound. And you might be surprised. It may be a sound you recognize as having heard, but didn't know what it was. So take the time and take a listen to the sound of queen talk. Well, as you can tell, the antennae are extremely important in a colony and for bee communication. Since they're so important, they've got to be kept in good shape and cleaned regularly. As you can tell from this honeybee right here, her antennae are pretty full of pollen, and they aren't going to be able to be the kind of receptors that the bee needs to have. So what the bee has to do is clean the antenna and keep it clean. Each of the four legs, and if you can see this bee here, I was able to get a picture of a bee cleaning her antenna. Her foreleg is wrapped around the antenna, and she's removing any dust or pollen from her antenna. The pictures here on the bottom of the slide show you in detail how this works. The antenna cleaner is on the front leg, on both sides. It's two parts, a notch, which is right here, is outfitted with a ring of stiff hairs and a corresponding spur, which is very tiny, really hard to see, but the little hair-like thing that is just above my pointer is the tibial spur. To use the antenna cleaner, the bee raises her foreleg over her antenna, like in this picture here, and then flexes her tarsus. So you can see she squeezes it closed, and it allows the spur to close the notch and form a ring around the antenna. As the bee pulls each antenna through the circular enclosure, the bristles remove debris such as pollen and dust, which otherwise would have interfered with the ability of the sensory organs to do what they needed to do. When a bee bends her leg, the plates pull apart. She stuffs the opening with pollen that she collects from her body. And first, she uses all 6 legs to scrape pollen into one place, the inside hind leg of the Bassotaurus. Then she combs it off the Bassotaurus with stiff bristles on the edge of the pollen press, called a pollen rake. So here's the press, and here's the rake. You can see the little teeth there. She cleans the left side with her right leg and the right side with the left until the open press is full of pollen. Combs on the inner surface of the hind Bassotaurus remove the pollen from the body hairs and pass it to the pollen press between the tibia and the Bassotaurus. Closure of the press forces the pollen into the pollen basket, the corbicula, on the outer surface of the tibia, where the pollen bolus is held in place by rows of hairs. You can see the pollen basket and the rows of hairs. Once in the hive, the honeybee removes the pollen with the aid of the antipial spur on the middle tibia. So her middle leg, her second leg, has a little bit larger spur than the tibial spur, and she uses that to pick out the pollen that she has gathered. So in summary, for those of you who often wonder how honeybees are able to communicate so effectively inside of a dark, active home with walls separating all their space, I hope that this gives you some idea and some information about a eusocial insect and how they communicate with one another and are able to accomplish so much with a relatively small body and a very small brain. And for those of you who maybe had never thought about how honeybees communicate so effectively, I hope this causes you to become interested in finding out more about remarkable honeybee communication.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen.
Sure,
Oops, you got a little bit more.
Well, just a little bit, the resources that I promised you, these are some easy to use, definitely understandable. 2 of my favorite authors are on here. Local author, Rusty Burlew, does a blog, and she does an extremely good job using layman's terms to explain scientific issues. And then Thomas Seeley, if you read no other book, read Honeybee Democracy.
Okay, well, again, thank you very much. Does anyone from the audience have a question? Oh, we have a thank you. And it doesn't have to be about honeybee communication. It can be about any anything related to honeybees or your bees or your hives?
Yeah, basically, please don't hesitate to ask us questions because this is an important time of the bee season. It's time for mite checks and making sure that they have enough food, and do you have to feed them? It's time to get ready for fall.
Oops. Sorry, we got some dog issues here. I don't see any questions in the chat. We have a couple of thank yous. So I guess that ends our session for this month. Please join us again next month. We have Ask a Washington Beekeeper every third Thursday of the month at 6 o'clock right here on Facebook Live. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Margot.